This first chapter is not a very long chapter. You can see it has about 21 slides. So our course objectives are here. Describing the purpose and features of the Genero Debugger is on today's agenda. You'll learn how to use the debugger to review your source code as it executes and how to step through the lines as you like. One step at a time, one line of code at a time, or many lines of code at a time. You'll learn about breakpoints and how to create breakpoints to stop program execution so that it gives you an opportunity to examine the source code more closely, perhaps check the contents of variables at that point in the application code, and other things that we'll learn about as we go along. You can see where you've come from, what source files, what functions have been executed up to that point. So it gives you a very good idea of where you've been and where you're currently at when you stop at one of these breakpoints. We also have something called a watch point that will also stop program execution, but unlike a breakpoint, a watch point doesn't stop program execution at a specific place in the code, a line of code. It actually stops program execution based on a condition, or based on a change in expression. Typically what you'll do is you'll specify a variable for a watch point, and when the value of that variable changes, then that will stop program execution. And it doesn't matter what line of code is being executed at that point, like it does with a breakpoint, it will stop wherever it is when that value changes. We'll learn more about watch points tomorrow. You can monitor variables while the application's running. You can see them change. They turn a bright red color and you can see the new value. We have a special view for that we'll look at here in just a few minutes. You can also change the value of a variable yourself while the application's running. And then of course you can watch to see how the execution of the program changes based on the variable change. You can see how it affects the way the program executes. You can view or trace functions called. Again, that's a special view. There's a backtrace view for that, so you can see where you're at and where you've been as far as source modules and functions are concerned. We also have special diagrams. We're going to look at those tomorrow. We're saying we can reverse engineer an application with dependency and sequence diagrams. So we'll learn all about those tomorrow. It's another way that you can trace the logic of an application without having to go through it yourself step by step. Of course, you don't get as much detailed information, but it gives you the general overview of an application and the execution of that application. Functions and in what order the functions are called and that type of thing. So here's 4 chapters that we'll be getting through for the next 2 days. We've got the course introduction, which is what we're looking at now. We have this introductory chapter that we're working on here. We've got the introduction to the Genero Debugger, where we look at all the different types of views and get a good overview of the functionality of the Genero Debugger and different modes that you can use with it. And then Module 2 is getting started with the debugger. Tomorrow we'll start on Module 3, analyzing errors with the debugger, and then look at some miscellaneous tools and other considerations. Introduction to the Genero Debugger. So here we're going to look at the overview. So the Genero Debugger allows you to test and control application behavior. It's easier to fix errors, easier to find errors with the debugger because you can review the source code as it executes. You can step through lines one line at a time if you like, or you can step through the code many lines at a time to get to a certain point in the application quickly if you want to. You can interrupt the program at any time during execution and then resume execution from that point when you're ready, after you've had a chance to perhaps look at the source code more closely. Perhaps you've chosen to look at some variable values to see if they're what you're expecting to see, and then you can resume execution from that point. I mentioned earlier you can also monitor or change the values of program variables and resume execution with those new values to see how that changes the behavior of the application. And you can also view or trace functions called while running a program. We have a special view for that. So it's a good way to familiarize yourself with the code that maybe someone else has written, or maybe it's even your code, but it's fairly complex. Perhaps you haven't looked at it in a while and now you have to go back and make some changes to it or do some maintenance to it. It's a good way to re-familiarize yourself with code that even you've written in some cases. We have a graphical interface for the debugger. So if you're familiar with Genero Studio, then it's very easy to get into the debugger. You're already familiar with the top menu options, the toolbar. We have all kinds of options for the debugger there. In the Debug top menu option, you can find the options here. We have toolbar options for the debugger. They're right in this vicinity right here at the top. We have right-click menu options that you can use to launch the debugger and set breakpoints. Lots of different ways to navigate with the debugger. So it's integrated into Genero Studio and integrated with the Genero Studio tools. The special views for the debugger are integrated into Genero Studio. We've got a series of tabs when you start the debugger. Across the bottom here, if you're familiar with the output view, these tabs are usually associated down here with the same area as the output view. So we have a data tab, we have a breakpoints tab, and a watchpoints tab that we can use. Those are 3 or 4 important views that we use with the debugger. We also have a command view, typically shows up right here. The command view you can see is the command line interface for the Genero debugger. You could actually use this FGLDB prompt at the command line. We have a debugger option for the command line. If you notice here in this little note block, we've got FGL run -D and then specify the name of the program. And that starts the program in debug mode if you prefer to debug from the command line. Then you get the debugger prompt, which is this same FGLDB that you see here in our command view in Studio, and you can type in the commands from the prompt if you prefer. In fact, this command view that we have in the debugger interface in Studio is a good way to learn the commands for the debugger. After you run the commands using, let's say, toolbar options for a while, you start memorizing them just because you always see them over here in the command view. See how it's got run, next, and so on? So all the commands that we run using menu options or toolbar icons in Studio show up in the command view along with command line output as well. The next 2 or 3 pages is talking about local debugging of an application and remote debugging. Just a few pages here on prerequisites or configuring the debugger to be able to do local or remote debugging. So the first page is on local debugging. If you're using Genero Studio, as we are for class purposes, usually the defaults that you have configured to be able to use Genero Studio for that application are sufficient for the debugger as well. So there's usually not any changes required. You just go from working on the application to debugging the application without having to do anything special. Now if you're working from the command line, you'll want to make sure that you have the right environment variables configured. So we've got this FGL source path environment variable that needs to be set so that the debugger can find the source code. So you'll want to check that. So here's a couple of examples, one for Unix so that you can see the proper formatting, and then here's a Windows example down here. But that's a prerequisite. If you're working from the command line, it has to be able to find the source, so you'll need to check that environment variable if it's not working properly. Remote debugging can be used for production environments. You can use a remote Genero Studio configuration for that. A remote Genero Studio configuration means that you have a remote Genero Studio configuration installed on the server that has the application source and executables. And then you also have a local Genero Studio client installed locally. And then you can run debugging against that Studio server. And the way it works is that your Studio client will be actually issuing requests and passing those over to the Genero Studio server, which will go ahead and execute those debugger requests on the behalf of the Studio client. So you can do remote debugging as well. There's a few rules though, and the rules are that all the application binaries, all the runnables, have to be on the remote server, and then all the application source files also have to be available on the remote server. So to configure remote debugging, when you have the concept of a client and a server for Genero Studio, I'm talking specifically about the Genero Studio client here, right there in the project view that you're familiar with, if you're familiar with Genero Studio, you create an empty application node. And then you rename that application node the same name as the application on the remote server that you're wanting to debug. So if it's called myapp.42r, you just name your application node myapp. And then you need to make sure that you have these environment variables set on the application node level. So let me just clarify that to show you where you would set these. FGLLD path, that's a library path. You want to make sure you've got your 42M and 42R file paths set there. And again, these paths have to be on the remote server. FGL resource path for any resource files, and for that, like your compiled form files is what they're referring to here, the .42f. These are your XML files that are form files are compiled to. It requires those when the form is loaded. FGL source path has to be set to the path used to access the remote source files. And again, those files could be available locally via Samba or NFS mount or a shared drive, network drive. So FGL DB path needs to be set to the path for the remote database schema files if you're working with a database. So these environment variables need to be set, and just to show you exactly where, let me pop this up. So here they're talking about creating an empty node here in Genero Studio. So I would just create I'll just create it down here in this project that I already have. So up here I'd say new application, and that creates a new application node, and I'll pretend I have an application called My App. So there's my new node, and it's named with the same name as the executable on the remote server that I want to debug. And then I need to set my environment variables that they were talking about on this application node. So I need to right click here. I can go into Advanced Properties, and then in Advanced Properties I can set these environment variables here. Click the plus sign, add the environment variable and the setting here. So that's the way that they're explaining here in the slide, that you need to set up your application node to be able to do remote debugging. I think I'll just get rid of that here. Best practices and limitations for remote debug sessions. We recommend SSH for your connectivity method, so you can use these GDC Direct Connect shortcuts, and if you use SSH, they're faster than VPN and easy to set up and easy to use. And you can use your remote studio configurations and specify SSH for your connection method for those. And the debugger in general is limited to being able to debug BDL code, the Genero language code. But any other languages that you might have, for example, with shared libraries, we support the Java Bridge so that you can integrate your Java classes. None of that, none of these other types of languages are debuggable with the Genero debugger. So you would need other tools for that, external tools. So we're just limited to Genero VDL. The source code is always required for debugging. It doesn't matter if it's local debugging or remote debugging. You have to have the source code. Topic 2 is on online help. So when you're working with the debugger, if there's any questions you have about functionality or commands that you can use with the debugger, perhaps there's a command that you don't see in the toolbar, you're wondering if it even exists, that maybe something you want to do and you don't see a way to do it. We have very good documentation for the debugger. So you can use the help button in the toolbar, the F1 key. Let me just show you what they're talking about there. If you've been using Genero Studio, I'm sure you're familiar with the help button that you can use to bring up our documentation. And if we look over here in the contents, we've got the Genero Studio user guide. You can do searches and look for debugger commands if you like. And there's lots and lots of good information there in the documentation. So that's one technique. You can just bring up the help and do a search and go look for what you're looking for. The other thing you can do when you're running the debugger, I'm just going to pop that up there quickly so we can see something. If I am in a certain area of the debugger, I can click F1. I know you couldn't see me click that, but I was in the data view, and if you just click the mouse in the data view or Watchpoints view or whatever view you're in, you can do an F1, hit the F1 key, and that will bring up help as well, but it will be already context help based on where you were when you click the F1 key. So that's another way to do it. That works pretty much anywhere in the interface. So two different documentation manuals that you can use for the debugger. The Genero Studio user guide that I just showed you has a whole section on the graphical debugger. You'll also find in the Genero Business Development Language user guide, the BDL user guide, you'll find a whole section on the debugger, and that will of course be oriented around the command line interface for the debugger. So if you're interested in the command line interface, you'll want to check out the BDL user guide. If you're working with Genero in Genero Studio, you'll probably focus on the Genero Studio user guide. And here it's just referring to in the Genero Business Development Language user guide, under Programming Tools, there's the Debugger section and all the commands. So it has a command reference there that you can look for if you're looking for a specific way to do something in the debugger. All right, well, let's go ahead and look at this Getting Started chapter. And then when we finish the Getting Started chapter, we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and do a demo. So we have two topics in this chapter. We have topic 1, which is basics about the debugger, the purpose and features of the debugger. And in topic 2, tracing logic with the Genero debugger. So breakpoints, the whole idea with breakpoints is to stop execution at a desired line or function. You can set breakpoints before a debugger session if you like, and you can also set breakpoints during debug sessions. And there's several different ways that you can set breakpoints. So let's say I'm going to do a debugger session on an application. Let's pick this one here. A good place to start is the source module that has the main program block. So if you don't really know what you're looking for at the point you're ready to start debugging, or even if you do, To give yourself a good stopping place, you might create a breakpoint in the main module, the module that contains the main program block. Now this is a good example of looking for a good place to stop. If you look at the code in this accounts.4gl module, there's not any function calls right away until we actually enter an interactive instruction, this menu statement, this interactive dialog. So if I just run the debugger, it's going to go all the way down to that interactive instruction before it stops executing the code. And that may be perfectly fine. Perhaps the problem area that you have is further along, so that would be okay to do that. And at that interactive instruction, if you want to get control of the application with the debugger, if you look right up here in the toolbar, you'll notice this, you think of it kind of like a pause button or an interrupt button. So if I click on that, that will also give me a way to stop execution at the point of that interactive instruction. So you can either go in and create an initial breakpoint before you start your debugger session, or if you know you have an application like this, has an interactive instruction early on, you can just go ahead and kick off the debugger and then interrupt it at the first interactive instruction, like this menu statement, and that will put you in the debugger, and the application is stopped at this point. And now I can go along and locate functions. I use the Code Structure view for that to find them quickly, and you can add breakpoints like that just by clicking in the gutter. You can add or remove breakpoints that way, or you can right-click on a line of code and there's an add or delete breakpoint there, or you can go all the way up to the menu and there's an add or delete breakpoint there. And notice there's even an F9 key for that. Got a shortcut for it. So there's, what is that, 5 different ways that you can add breakpoints. Typically what I do is I just click in the gutter of the application. A lot of times I'll find functions quickly that I'm working on or I want to look at more closely. I'll find them over here in the Code Structure view, like this Query Account function. And if you click on that, that will scroll through the code in the code editor till you get to that function, and then you can click in the gutter and add a breakpoint. All right, so let me kill that again and just say, so typically you'll want to start off with a breakpoint, or if you see that you have an interactive instruction coming up quickly, you can just go ahead and kick off the debugger session and then interrupt it when it gets to the interactive instruction, either way. So this time, before I start my debugger session, I'm going to create an initial breakpoint right here. Now that's not a very good place, it would stop there anyway. Let's say right here at this close window screen. And that way I know it's going to stop execution before it gets to that interactive instruction. Now if I want to, I could also go over here and click on some of these functions over here in the Code Structure view and add some additional breakpoints by clicking over here in the gutter as well. But for this first iteration, I'll just leave it with 1. All right, so now I should have 1 breakpoint on this close window statement, and whenever I start my debugger session, I'll start it this way this time. Notice it stops at that breakpoint, and that gives me a chance to look at the code. Notice the module that contains the source code is opened in Code Editor. If it's not already open, it'll open it there, and I'll have the current line of code that's being executed highlighted in that Code Editor window. And then I've got my views so that I can examine my variable values. I can see what line I'm at in the code, what functions I've already visited, and so on. And we'll come to that here presently. All right, so that's breakpoints. Typically, I click in the gutter in Code Editor to create a breakpoint, but you can see there's 3 or 4 other methods that you can use for that. We'll talk more about watchpoints tomorrow. Watchpoints stop execution when the value of an expression changes. And by expression, we typically mean a variable value. So we can add a variable to the watchpoint view at any time while a session is running, and then when that variable value changes, then the program execution will stop on whatever line of code it's on when that value changes. So it's different from a breakpoint because a breakpoint always stops program execution at a specific line of code, regardless of variable values or what's going on in the application. But watchpoints stop execution of the code when a value changes, a value that you've specified. And we do that by adding a variable to the watchpoint view. Something else that's interesting about watchpoints is that they are not persistent across sessions. So if you're working with breakpoints, and a few minutes ago I went in and set a breakpoint, if I exit out of the application, that breakpoint is still there. So if I come back into the application, let's say a week later, and I want to run another debugger session, my breakpoints are still there, and they will still be active if I haven't disabled them for some reason. But watchpoints disappear. So if I've gone in and created watchpoints during a debugger session, those watchpoints will be gone. As soon as I stop the application and run another debugger session, the watchpoints won't be there. So we'll talk more about watchpoints tomorrow, is where we'll really focus in on watchpoints, but just a brief introduction to the idea. So just like breakpoints, they stop program execution so that you can get a closer look at what's going on, but they only stop program execution based on changing of a value that you've specified, a variable value. So here's the debugger views. There's a few more views that we'll be looking at tomorrow, but for today these are the views that we'll focus on. We have the breakpoint view I showed you just a moment ago, and we'll focus in on that more here in just a minute. Displays information on all the breakpoints that you currently have configured. You'll see enabled breakpoints as well as disabled breakpoints in that view. And you can disable them, enable them, delete them, and so on right there inside the breakpoint view. The data view displays program variable values, and there's a lot of options for manipulating those variables. You can look at the variables, of course, monitor them, but you can also change the variables. You can add variables to a user-defined area or a user area to make them easier to monitor so that they show up better instead of being buried perhaps in a local variable area or a global variable area. You can move them to isolate them so that you can see them better. What else can you do? You can change the value of a variable in the data view. So this is the view you would use to monitor your variables and manipulate your variables during program execution. The output view is the same output view that you're familiar with from working with applications in Genero Studio. But there is a special debugger view for the output view, or a debugger channel they call it in the output view, so that you can focus in on just debugger messages. There's a command view that I showed you earlier that displays the command history and the output from the commands. So the command view is a good way to learn the debugger commands. If you ever decided you wanted to use the debugger from the command line, you could after you've studied the command view for a few sessions. It also allows you right there in the Genero Studio interface to enter commands at the command view window. There's a prompt there. So if you want to enter command line commands there, you can, or you can use your toolbar or menu options. And then finally, the Backtrace view displays your ordered list of function calls. So it's handy to see where the program goes from function to function as it executes, and you can track your progress through those functions. So it's a good way of learning the flow of a program. So let's just pop in here and look at some of these views. Get out of the PowerPoints for a few minutes. So here we've got this session running We're looking at this accounts application with the debugger, and currently we're stopped here at a breakpoint on line 14 of this accounts.4gl module. So down here at the bottom, we've got some of the views we were talking about. Currently we're looking at the data view, so we can see all of the defined variables right now. So here we've got our, let me close these up for just a minute. We've got a user variable area that's empty. And this is the location I was talking about where you could move a variable that you're interested in. Let's say you've got a program that has a lot of variables defined. It's hard to find anything here in the data view because there's so many variables. You can right-click on a variable and you can move it to this user area. Copy to user variable. So that moves it up here so that you can quickly see any changes to the values for that variable. So they won't be, let's say, buried with a whole bunch of other local variables in this example. So that's the user area. You can also tell when the value of a variable changes. Let's just go ahead and we'll move along. Here's a continue. I'm just going to hit continue up here, and watch the command view. When I click on the continue option, it will reflect the command that I run. Notice, see here, fglDB continue, and of course the output is continuing. So I click continue, so that moved us down to this breakpoint here on close window screen. So I've got a breakpoint there, so it stopped execution again. Oh, I wanted to point that out. Hang on one second, let me just do it again. I'm going to remove this breakpoint. I'm going to move it way up here so that I can show you something important here. So let me fire this off again. Alright, so I'm stopped here at this breakpoint, and I hit continue, and notice that all of a sudden my debugger commands have grayed out. Notice how I don't have these options in the toolbar for next or continue or step in. They're all grayed out. So the reason that they're grayed out right now is because we've reached an interactive instruction here in our application. And when you reach an interactive instruction in the application, it turns control back over to the user. So the user has to do something just as though it was a normal execution of the application. So if I hit this query button, perhaps do a search, and then I can go ahead and get control back then by hitting that interrupt. But any time that you get to an interactive instruction in the program, the control is taken away from the debugger to turn control over to the end user. So at this point, of course, you're the end user, so you interact with the screen just as you would as if you were running the program normally. So you do a query, for example, or modify, whatever it is you're trying to explore in the debugger at that point. And then when you're finished with that, then you can go ahead and hit continue again to continue. But anytime you're in an interactive instruction, it's going to turn control over to the user. So here I'm sitting in the menu, do a query. Notice when I hit the query button, it gave me control back again, so I'm going to hit next. And I can see now that after I have this action query triggered, the next step is going to be to call a particular function. Right here, I think we'll see this in a minute, but right here is a step into option, that we step into command that you have with the debugger. If I just clicked next, which I think I'll do, if I just click next, I won't see this function executed line by line. It'll just go right on down to the next line of code without entering that function so that I can see what happens. Now the only exception to that is if I had already gone out to this query account and put a breakpoint there. So if I had gone out and put a breakpoint there, that would be the exception. I don't need to step into the function in that case, because if there's a breakpoint there, it will automatically step in so that it can stop at that breakpoint and show me the executable code in Code Editor, or show me the code in Code Editor. So that's an exception to it. Alright, so I'm going to get rid of these breakpoints. Let's use the breakpoint menu to do that. So notice right now I just have one breakpoint left. I have the option here to delete all breakpoints. So I get this prompt that says, do you really want to delete all your breakpoints? I'm going to say yes. So now I don't have any breakpoints available to me. Here's my data view. And you can see I've got my local variables, module variables, and so on. And when a value changes in one of these variables, notice you get an exclamation mark here. So right here, if I had all of these closed up, I could easily tell that there's been a change to a variable in local variables and global variables at this point. So if I want to see those changes, of course I have to dig down to find it. So this variable query OK has changed values to a 1. And in my global variables, this global SQL record has SQL warn, has changed values. So that's how you can quickly tell if a variable has changed value in the data view by the red exclamation marks. I wanted to show you that before we moved on. Alright, so that's the breakpoints view. Well, here's the data view. We've talked about copying to a user variable area so that you would have those variables there where they're easy to see. You can also edit a value in the data view and see what happens during the execution of the program with that changed value. And that gives you an idea what happens if the value is not what the expected value is. The output view we've looked at, it's very similar to the output view that you're already familiar with. But when you're running a debugger session, you've got an additional option here, which is this debug channel, they call it, so that you see debug information only. I think it actually, if we run the debugger session, you'll notice that it automatically pops back to the default view, which nowadays I think is fine because it includes all of the debugger information here. So notice here's all of our debugger output. So I think for the most part you can just leave it here at the default channel and you'll actually get more information than you do with the debug channel that you see here. So I actually prefer the default channel, but just be aware that you've got some good output here for debugger sessions. Here's the command view. All the debugger commands display in the command view. You can even type in commands in the command view yourself if you like. So I can go right in here myself once I'm familiar with some of these commands, and I can do next, for example, and it will go ahead and run the next command. The next command happened to be the menu statement in this case, an interactive instruction that I have to work on, but you can just type in the commands right there. So if you get familiar with them and you prefer to enter the commands that way, you can certainly do it. The Backtrace view gives you an ordered list of functions that are called during execution. So let's see where we're at on the Backtrace view. Right now we're still sitting in the main, so we haven't made it very far. So let's go ahead and continue and get a little bit farther. Go ahead and query here. And continue so that we can keep going. Have to click OK. And now we'll click Next. So what I'm doing here is stepping into some of these functions so that you can see them. So I'm going to step into that one. Now you've got a better picture of your Backtrace view. So if you look at the Backtrace view, now you can see that we've started out in the main function. We've moved up to the query account function, so we've entered that, and the query account function in turn has called the get account count function. So we'll just kind of step through there. And here we are at the return. So if you watch the Backtrace view, if I click one more time, notice that it's gone back to the query account function. So that's a good place where you can keep track of moving through the functions and see which functions call other functions. You can tell what line and what source module that those functions are on. So here's our debugger macro options. I mentioned earlier that watchpoints are not saved, but one of the things you can do to work around that, for example, let's say that you want to show someone else an issue with an application. One of the ways that you can do that is by recording a macro, and you can send them the macro, and if they have the source code as well, they can rerun the macro and be able to do the same steps that you did when you ran the debugger, and therefore see the same things that you saw. So let me show you the macros here. So right here is an option to record macros. So if I go up into the debug menu option, I can click on the record macro, and anything that I do now in the debugger is recorded to a text file. Just a simple text file that you could edit manually if you wanted to. But let's say now that I go to the data view and I add a value here to being kind of stubborn. Let me get off of that. Maybe a count. I'm going to add that to watch. It won't let me add the one I'm already currently sitting in. So now if I look at my watch points, I do have a watch point added to this account count. And then I can continue on, do a few more things, step into a function perhaps, and then go up here, and once I'm finished with my exploration, I can go up here and stop recording. So when I click stop recording, I can save that. I'll just save it here to my desktop. And then now I could send that text file to somebody and they could run it as well. And that's what it looks like. It's just a simple text file. There's the watch where we've created, added that variable value and created a watch point on it. That's the command line option to do that. And then we did a few more things there in the debugger just so we wouldn't have that one line in the text file. And that's just a simple text file that you could create from scratch if you like and send to someone. You could even add commands, obviously, to this if you wanted to. But that's all a macro is. So then if you replay that macro later in another debugger session, it will recreate the watch point. So that's a workaround for this idea that watch points are not persistent. They don't persist beyond the session you use them with. Now breakpoints you don't have to worry about, right? Because breakpoints do persist, but not watch points. Alright, tracing logic with the debugger. We've been doing that already, just walking through the program, but you can see that the debugger provides a quick way to familiarize yourself with code that somebody else has written or your code as well, if it's been a while since you've worked with it. So here we're using the Office Store example to show you how to review your source code as it executes and how to step through one line or lots of lines at a time, interrupt the program, resume execution, all the things that you'd want to do in a typical debugger session. I wanted to get you familiar with the Office Store application because that's the application you'll be using for your lab exercise later this afternoon. So if you're familiar with the Office Store application, or even if you're not, you can get to it over here in the Welcome page in Genero Studio. You should have the Office Store as one of your, well, if we look at tutorials and samples, you should have the Office Store in your samples and demos. So if you click on Office Store, that should open it up in your project view. And the application that we're going to be working with this week for labs is this Accounts application, this first application up here at the top. So it's a fairly complex application that was created using the Application Modeler, or BAM. And that's the reason I wanted to use it, because it's a complex enough application. It has a lot of source modules. It's got the source modules here for the accounts table, but it also makes use of a lot of these modules here in this entities library node. So look at all of these different intermediate files, and a lot of these are source modules as well. So these generated applications can be quite complex because they do make use of a lot of intermediate files that are generated files, and as well as an external project that I'll have you add that has some, we'll call them library routines for generated code for database functions. So it makes a good application then for you to explore with a Genero debugger session, because it is fairly complex and it gives you something to really work with. So that's what we'll be using for class this week. For the most part, will be this Office Store sample. So tracing logic then, to more or less review what we've already talked about this morning, you'll probably want to start out by setting some initial breakpoints. And again, we typically start with the main program block and set a breakpoint there just to stop program execution before it gets too far along. If you don't add any initial breakpoints, remember that the program will execute all the way to the point where it enters an interactive instruction before it stops the first time. So if you're interested in anything that takes place before that interactive instruction, you'll need to put in a breakpoint. If you're not interested in anything before the first interactive instruction, you can just go ahead and start the debugger session, let it go all the way to the interactive instruction, and then you'll have that interrupt or pause icon that you can use to get control with the debugger. And from there you can add breakpoints at that point if you like, or you can start stepping through the program using your navigation keys or commands. Next, continue, step in, step out, and so on. So there's what we're looking at in the source, this account.4gl source module. In this case, we're starting here in the main program block. This first part of the main program block is not very interesting for us perhaps. It just has some housekeeping routines. So we might choose to put that first initial breakpoint down here where it actually calls the first function. Call account_open first form. So that's be a good place in this application to put that first breakpoint. Now be aware that a breakpoint is not actually associated with a line number. So this breakpoint is not really tied to line 48. It's tied to this command or to this line of code. Call account open first form. So if I go in here later and let's say I add a bunch of code here, insert a bunch of code, or if I go in and delete a bunch of lines of code, that breakpoint will still be on this call account open first form. So the breakpoints are tied to the line of code, not the line number. So that's kind of an important concept with the debugger. So that's a good place to start out, at least for this application, before it gets too far and enters the first interactive instruction. Remember too that an easy way to find functions that you might want to put some breakpoints on, those entry points for functions, is to use the code structure view. If you use the code structure view, you can just very easily find a source module, see all of the different functions for that source module, and then you can navigate between those source modules by clicking on the functions, and it'll scroll forward in Code Editor to that function so that you can very quickly put a breakpoint there if you like. So notice this one in the code structure view here, I'm looking at an external function. In other words, it's not in the current module, but if I click on that, notice it will automatically open that module and place me at the point where that function entry point is. And if I didn't already have one, I could add my breakpoint. And notice when I enter that account form underscore UI4GL, which was an external module, now I have access to all of the functions in that module in my code structure view. And again, I can just pop through here very quickly and add breakpoints if I like, wherever I like at those function entry points. So that's a quick way to do it. Use your code structure view to navigate between modules and functions. To start the debugger session, we saw several different ways to do that. Once we have our initial breakpoints set the way we want them, we can use the debug top menu options to do that and select debug from there. We can right-click on the application, as we see we've done down here at the bottom of this screenshot, and there's a debug option there. You also have the debug icon in the toolbar. Also, the debug icon will start the debugger session on whatever has been set to be the current application or the default application. So let's take a peek at that. So I can tell which one of these applications in this project is the default application. Let me close that all up, because it's the one in bold. So notice that orders is not in bold, but the accounts application is. If I wanted to make the orders application the default application, I could do that here by right-clicking on it and setting this set as default application. But we're working with the accounts application, so we actually want it to be the default. So since it is the default, I can just hit this debug icon, and that will start my debugger session. So to start out on this guy, get rid of that. Let me just clean that up a bit. I'm going to open up this first module here that has our main program block in it. And I'm going to scroll down past all this housekeeping stuff that's not very exciting for me. And this little account install function also is more house cleaning. So I'm going to start right here with this call account underscore open first form. And I'm going to put my first breakpoint there. So here's an externals that's showing me that I have an external function here. So if I click on that, it opens it up, and here I have access to all these different functions in that. So if I click through these, if I wanted to add some additional breakpoints, I can. I've already added some of those while we were talking. All right, so I was thinking let's pick we'll use the debug icon this time to kick off the debugger session. And this is something else I wanted you to see while we're in our session, our lecture today. If you get this prompt, and you will, when you start going in and adding breakpoints, you're actually modifying these source files. So when you get this message, if you hit reload or reload all, I always hit reload all. If you say keep, what it will do is use a temporary file for your session, and you won't be able to manipulate it. You won't be able to add breakpoints to it, for example, because it's using a temporary file. So say reload, and I usually just say reload all, and it just makes sure that it's not actually opening a temporary file. So now that we've got that, got my debugger session started here, and you can see here that we've stopped at our first breakpoint to start our session. So from here I could step in to that function with the step into, and that puts me inside this account open first form function at the first line of executable code. If I use the next button, I'm going through the application code one line of code at a time. If I click continue, and again I've got the icon here for continue, or I've also got this debug option, I could use menu option, and I could use the continue here. So if I say continue, it's going to go through many lines of code until it reaches the next breakpoint. So either the next breakpoint, if you have watchpoints configured, it'll go to the next watchpoint if that comes up first, right? If a variable value changes that you're watching, or if you enter an interactive instruction, that will stop the progress of the application, whichever one it gets to first. So we've seen how to control the debug session with the step in to step into a function if you want to see it execute the lines of code in that function one step at a time, perhaps. You can also step out of a function, and that will leave the function without showing you any other lines of code executed. It will execute all the lines of code in the function as it normally would. You just won't be viewing that. So it'll step out and show you the first line of code outside of that function that's executable. And then of course we have the continue option that we saw that lets you execute many lines of code until you either reach another breakpoint, trigger a watch point, or enter an interactive instruction. So once it stops at a breakpoint, you'll have to tell it what to do next. You can either, in this case, step into that function, tell it to step in, next, or continue. And there's our debug commands there in the toolbar that we've been looking at. This is next on the far left, that just moves forward into the executable code one line at a time. This is the step into, which steps into a function so that you can execute the lines of that function one line at a time and see them execute if you like. If you are done with a function and you're not interested in seeing any additional lines of code executed, you can step back out of the function. And then we have the continue option here on the far right that just goes ahead and executes many lines of code until it reaches another breakpoint, watch point, or interactive instruction. So we've got these options in the toolbar. We've got the same options in the menu. So here we saw earlier that if I hit an interactive instruction, like a menu statement, a construct statement where we're doing a query by example, any type of interactive instruction will switch control back to the application screen. So all of your options to continue, next, step in, all of those options will gray out until you have responded to the application screen. So it behaves just as though you were running the application outside of the debugger. So you need to respond as normally, and then once you've responded to the application screen and it's ready to exit out of the interactive instruction, then you get control back. To stop the debugger session, you can click on the stop sign, which is the abort option, and you've got three different places that you can do that. You've got it in the toolbar, you've got it in the task view, and you've got it in the right-click option as well. Well, I've demonstrated the debugger features for the most part. So let me go ahead and we'll just do a bit more of the demonstration, and if you wanted to follow along you could, but you've got a good lab that you can use to really explore this Office Store application in detail. And I would recommend doing the lab because it gives you a good workout with all of these different options, Backtrace View, the Data View, Breakpoints, and so on, Code Structure View. So let me stop this, do a quick review, and then I'll let you go to work on your lab today. So here we are in the Accounts application. We want to make sure, I'm going to close this second source module and put us back here. Scroll up to the top. I'm going to pick a likely place to put my first breakpoint, and I think this account underscore open first form is fine. So I'm going to go in and add my first breakpoint. What I might do is just go ahead and start the session at that point. I'm just going to use the context-sensitive menu option here for that. And of course it's going to stop at my first breakpoint. Here I could go ahead and look at my data view, and if I'm interested in what's in there at this point, I could. I don't have any watch points. Remember, watch points aren't persistent, so I haven't created any, so there's no watch points to look at. I just have the one breakpoint. And notice my breakpoint has a hit count of 1 now because I'm sitting there in the source code. So that hit count, of course, is incremented for each time the program execution has stopped at that breakpoint. So from here, I probably would just want to step into that function. So here I've stepped in, and if you look, we're now inside of this open first form function at the first line of executable code. So I can pop through here one line at a time to see. This is essentially just doing some initialization. But I might be interested in this function call, account form UI open form. If I'm interested in it, I can go ahead and step into it. If I've already investigated it and I'm not interested in it, I can just click next and it will skip out. It will skip it, right? It will not enter it. So I'm just going to hit next to show you. And notice it did not enter that function. It just went on to the essentially the interactive instruction. Now here I'm sitting in this interactive instruction, but I'm not looking at the code for that interactive instruction. If I want to get there, I just hit this interrupt or pause button up here. So if I click that, notice it puts me in that dialog statement. Anyway, I think that's about all of the tips and tricks that I can think of for just getting familiar with it. Anytime that you want to quickly mark some breakpoints on function entry points or something, use the code structure view as a quick, easy way without having to scroll through the whole source file. You can just click on these and give yourself some good breakpoints. And that saves having to scroll through hundreds of lines of code in some cases. Any questions before we go over the lab? Then tomorrow we'll regroup and we'll learn about watch points and conditional breakpoints and conditional watch points, what those are and how to use them. And then we'll also look at the sequence and dependency diagrams we talked about today during the introductory chapter.